These here that we're going to be showing you are ones that we've not looked at before. We come to Ezra and Nehemiah this evening, which is our post-exilic period. Both of these books deal with the restoration of the people of Israel back to their land. Now, Haggai and Zechariah have also dealt with this. Remember, Esther, although it comes during the Persian time period, has nothing to do with the exiles, because it is a book dealing with those that are still in captivity. They're not subjects anymore, but they nonetheless have chosen to stay in the realm of the Persians rather than going back to their homeland. However, Ezra and Nehemiah, both of these books deal with certain returns. Really, all three of the returns, the first, second, and third return of the exiles back to their homeland. And so what we've got right here is to show you we're during the Persian time period. You'll also need your Kings and Prophets chart with you. I trust you still bring these with you. I don't know about yours. Mine's worn out around the corners now. Of course, mine at home is more worn out than the one up here. I just use this whenever I'm here. I've got several sets just to keep them from getting too worn out. We've used this one quite a bit already. It's very important. It really does help you see the time period of the kings and the prophets. Amen. But, of course, we're beyond now the times of the Jewish kings and the Jewish prophets, because we're getting down into the Persian time period. Now, I've got several different ones to show you. This doesn't have the Persian Empire. It's got Babylon. I don't see a date on it. It's because it's dealing with the time that Babylon is a world kingdom, a world empire. Because at the same time Babylon is a world power, so is Media, except that the Median kingdom doesn't extend quite as far south as the Babylonian kingdom, but yet the Babylonian kingdom doesn't extend quite as far north as the Median kingdom. Now, Persia, it's always referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire because, generally speaking, you've got two nations combined. You've got the Median kingdom that came on the scene chronologically first, followed by the Persian kingdom. Now, as I'll show you another map where you can read right here, what's this body of water? Persian Gulf. Must mean Persia somewhere near. Well, it's just off of the map right here in the corner. Now, Media is generally this region just due south of the Caspian Sea. Now, the Black Sea we've studied in the book of Acts. This is a different sea that's a little further east, so you'll have to get this in your vocabulary, the Caspian Sea. And Media is generally, the realm of Media is right here, but of course its empire extends all the way through Turkey over to the eastern fringe of Asia Minor. Here we've got Persia down here in this spot. Now let me show you another one that's a little more detailed. This is a topographical map to show you what the Persian Empire looks like. And here it's going to be called the Persian Empire because Persia has taken over Media at this time. And we'll be looking at these more in a future connection. This part over here is really what we need to see. Okay, we're back over here. This is where we were. This was over at the far part of your map last time. This is still the Persian Gulf. And you can see it, Persis, spelled lightly right there. This is Persia. This is where ancient Persia was found. And there's Media. Generally, it's a little further east than where they've got it, but still you can tell that it's south of the Caspian Sea. This is Media. Okay, according to the legend of the map, your whole red outline. Can you all see that takes up the whole Mesopotamian world? What Assyria controlled at one time, what Babylon controlled at one time, or really they didn't control quite this much. Persia is a very far-flung empire, and it's known as the Medo-Persian Empire together. You can see that Palestine happens to be included right in the fringe over here of the domination and control of Medo-Persia, because she certainly is controlled by the Persians. Now, there are four important capitals to remember in the Persian Empire. It might be a little hard to see. I'll try to find them for you. First of all, Babylon. It's the ones with the red dots. These are royal residences. And there were 4 important ones, although I think they have a 5th one on here. You just need before. Babylon was an important capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. Ecbatana, and that's right in Ezra, and we'll see that in a moment. Ecbatana was a famous capital. Then how do they have it spelled? I think they've got Susa, S-U-S-A. In our Bible, it's Shushan, rather than Susa, S-U-S-A, it's Shushan. And we'll show you several places where that appears. Some of these appear in the Bible. These first 3 do. And the last one doesn't, known as the richest city of the world this time, Persepolis. Persepolis, which is right here. Now, they have another one, but you don't need to be concerned about that. These 4, Babylon, Shushan, Ecbatana, and Persepolis, are the 4 important capitals of Persian Empire. You say, can they have more than one capital? Well, certainly. The kings, according to whatever their fancy was, moved around from one capital to another. Those that were really anti-Babylon, of course, would be in Babylon, because there you've got the former capital of the Babylonian Empire, and you're ruling in it. If you want, if maybe you've got more of a Median background, you'd be up farther here, to Ecbatana. And if you want to be in the richest city, you'd be down here in Persepolis. Although we find them many times here in Shushan, because it happens to be right in the middle of the empire, happens to be right in the middle of all the other capitals. And that's the one that we see in Nehemiah's book. We see that in chapter 1 of his book. We see it in chapter 1 of Esther's book. And we see it in chapter 8 of Daniel's book. All 3 of which passages we'll look here in a moment. So this is what we're talking about when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. Babylon as such has passed off the scene. She's conquered by Cyrus in 539 B.C. And as a result, the Medes and the Persians come to domination in the world. And so this is what we're concerned about whenever we open up to the post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, another thing that I can show you is what the community of exiles look like, and it's going to be a little surprising. You have to put those double on together to show you how small they are whenever we finally gotten the return of the exiles, which I think this is going to be dated Nehemiah's time. Whereas formerly, remember, all of this was Palestine here. You got Israel, the northern kingdom, and that's all that she has left now. Restoration of Judah, 445 B.C., time of Nehemiah. Nothing but just a little spot on a map. And that's just a spot in the whole Persian Empire. Sometimes the critics are always concerned about why some of these biblical things aren't mentioned more often in some of our old Persian texts. But look, this is just a dot on the map. Persia's not really concerned too much about Palestine or about Jerusalem. It's a dot on the map of their vast empire that they have. They're more concerned about a little further west of here and the Hellenes, the Greeks, because they're the ones with whom they must contend afterwards. So this is as small as the community of restored exiles happens to be. Very, very, very small. Okay, if we'll go back over to Ezra's book now, we have, and with this we'll need our charts, we have 2 time periods that will be dealt with in these 2 books. First of all, the time period 536 through 516 B.C. And here we have our first return of the exiles. Under Zerubbabel, the governor, Joshua, the priest, and Haggai and Zechariah, the prophet. All right, now you can see this very clearly on your chart, the bottom left-hand portion. The most important king during this time is Cyrus. He begins the Achaemenid line of Persian kings. He had been controlled by the Medians until he overthrows his Median overlord, Astyages. All of this is on your map in 550. And after overthrowing the yoke of Astyages, then the Persians come to the forefront rather than the Medes, although it's still referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire, Medo-Persian Kingdom. And with Astyages, you have an end there, you can see around 550, of your Median kings, and you have the beginning of your Achaemenid line of Persian kings with Cyrus. 550, I believe he's 40 years old here when he comes to the throne, so he lives to be quite old. He lives to be 70, 80 years old here while he's reigning on the throne. Now Babylon falls underneath Cyrus's name, the Neo-Babylonian. There'd been an old Babylonian empire back during the days of Hammurabi between Abraham and Moses. This is the Neo, which simply means the new Babylonian Empire, falls in 539, October, the middle of October of 539. Cyrus has already defeated Lydia, and he has fortified his eastern frontier borders. And then in 539, the fall, he begins to concentrate his full force upon Babylon, and she falls, of course, in the end of Daniel chapter 5, where you've got Darius the Mede, who is 62 years old, who comes to the throne as far as ruling that particular part of what becomes the whole Persian Empire. Cyrus is king, universal, but Darius the Mede, 62 years old, becomes king here in Babylon. Now, in the first year of Cyrus's rule, we read in the end of 2 Chronicles 36, the beginning of Ezra 1. The second or the first year of his reign, which the way they compute it would be 538, he issues his famous decree that the exiles would be allowed to return back to their homelands. Remember, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, especially the Assyrians, had a different policy as far as exiles were concerned. Once the Assyrians took Israel and Samaria, then they deported some of the people and then imported some foreign people, so you'd get a mixture of marriages there. Now, Babylon didn't have the importation, but she did have the deportation of people out of their native land over to Babylon. Whereas the Persian kings, especially Cyrus, who's a very generous king, and he's known from history as being a very kind, benevolent, generous king, does just the opposite. Rather than keep the subjects and make more, he releases the subjects, namely the Jews, which had been subject under the Babylonian Empire, in 538. Now, if you'll open your Bible to Ezra, you see this in the very first verse. Now, in the first year, 538, now it doesn't mean this is Cyrus's first year. He's been ruling since 550. Really, he's been ruling since way before that. But this is first year as far as the new kingdom is concerned. The first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord might be fulfilled, Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king, verse 3, Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. So here in the very beginning, he passes the proclamation and the Persian decree that allows whoever wants to go back, and you've got to remember that most of them don't want to go back. They're very secure in their business endeavors in which they have engaged, and most of them desire to stay right there in Babylon because they're not oppressed. They haven't been oppressed even under Babylon. Remember, Jeremiah said, Go and build houses and plant vineyards because you'll prosper in Babylon. And they prosper so much that when it's time to return back to the theocratic nation, most of them opt to stay where they are, which is very tragic. Those that do are recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. That's what Ezra and Nehemiah is all about. Now, in the end of 2 Chronicles, you'll notice that the first or the last three verses are the same as the first three verses in Ezra, word for word. Now, that simply is to show us that Ezra, as well as Nehemiah, are simply a continuation of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And that's why we have them placed all here together. Because Chronicles was one book, Ezra and Nehemiah was one book, and really both of these two groups of books together was one book Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, because those last three verses are word for word the same as what we have here in the beginning of Ezra. Because you see, 2 Chronicles 36 ends with the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And then verse 21 speaks about their 70-year captivity period. See, it gets all of it in just in a condensed form. And then in verse 22, which is the same as Ezra 1:1, now we're already through with the period of captivity, and we're going to have the restoration of those willing exiles back to the theocratic nation, which you find here in the first few verses of Ezra. Now this takes us from 538, whenever the decree is actually made, or we'll date it right now, 536, the date I just gave you, because this is when the temple is begun, down to, on your chart, 516, when the temple is completed. And once it's completed, then you don't see much about Haggai, Zechariah, Zerubbabel, and so forth. You don't see much about them anymore, because you basically got this 20-year time period where things are very important and things are very crucial. Now the second time period is from 458 to around 433. Notice there's about a 3/4 of a century gap between the two time periods, and Esther's book is what fits in between these two time periods. 458, staying with the date they gave us on our chart for Ezra, to 433. And here we have the important figures of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Okay, under the first time period, the important subject is the rebuilding of the temple. Under the second time period, the important subject is the rebuilding and fortification of the city of Jerusalem, involved with two different things. You see, when Ezra and Nehemiah, they're not concerned about building the temple. The temple has been built. That's what Haggai and Zechariah were prophesying to Joshua and Zerubbabel for. Let's get on the ball rather than building our own houses and get the Lord's house built. That's what all of Haggai chapter 1 is about. Stop worrying about your own concerns. That's why you don't have anything, because you put money in bags that I've already torn holes in the bottom of. And whenever you bring your grain home, I blow up on it so that you end up with nothing, because you're putting the emphasis in the wrong area. You're seeking your own pleasure, your own meeting of your needs, rather than the building of the temple. And so this is what takes place during the first period. However, from 458 to 433, you've got the rebuilding now and the fortification of the city. Because a city without walls is not a city, according to the ancient standards. That was one of the requirements for having a city. You had to have walls. Now, they had their temple, and that's what they needed for religious reasons. That's what was important in the beginning, to get their temple, which is what they get. But then in the second period, we have the rebuilding and the fortification of the walls of the city, rebuilding of Jerusalem. And Esther comes between both of these. Now, after this, we have 3 periods of return of the exiles. First of all, we have our return in 536. And of course, this is under Zerubbabel. So in those two time periods I just gave you, 536 to 516, then the first of the 3 exilic returns fits under the first time period, which would be under Zerubbabel, around 536. We're given account of this in Ezra 2. And Ezra 2 is exactly the same as Nehemiah 7. Both the chapters are the same thing. Both of them speak back here to the first return of the exiles. Then we have a second return, and by the way, that's of around 50,000 Jews. Then we have a second return in 458. Now, both of these latter 2 returns comes under the latter time period. The first return goes under the former time period, but the second and the third return comes under the latter period. And here we have just over 1700 returning with the scribe Ezra, which we have account of in Ezra chapter 8. All right, now you can see all this. We're following right along on your chart. 458 is the date of Ezra, and that's when Ezra is allowed, I think it's in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. At least Artaxerxes is the king then. And around the 7th year of Artaxerxes, Ezra, along with around 1,700 people, and he ends up hardly with no Levites, and he has to stay longer than he intends to get enough Levites to join the group, so they'll have a priestly function with them. But they are allowed of Artaxerxes now to go back to Palestine. And then the third return is in around 455, where you've got Nehemiah along with an army escort. He, of course, also under Artaxerxes the first. Returns, and this is told about over in Nehemiah chapter 2. Now, the important king during Ezra and Nehemiah is Artaxerxes the first. Artaxerxes the first. He's king during practically all the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. You back up to Esther. Who was the important king during Esther's time? Xerxes. All right, we back all the way back up to Zerubbabel. Who's the important king then? Cyrus. And then whenever you get to the end of that time period, 516, who's the important king then? Darius the first, Hystaspes. So you've got those four important kings that figure in with these biblical books. Cyrus is important during the beginning of Zerubbabel's time. By the end of Zerubbabel's time, you've gone through Cambyses and Bardidia, known as Pseudo-Smyrtis, but they're not important. By the end of the time, you come to Darius the first, Hystaspes, mentioned many times in Scripture. This is all here on your chart again. By the time we get to Esther, then Ahasuerus or Xerxes is the important king. And then by the time we get to Ezra, Nehemiah, it's Artaxerxes. Now you have to keep in mind who is king, and that's why I'm giving you an outline of the time period. You have to keep in mind what's going on when, because as things get confusing, such as in Ezra 4, well, all of Ezra 4 is one of the most confusing portions of Scripture in any of these books that we're studying now, because everything seems to be all out of chronological order. And it is, as far as chronological order from verse 1 to verse 2 to verse 3, etc., is concerned, then everything is all backwards and swapped around chronologically. And you see, some of you out there may think you know something about the Old Testament, but wouldn't take me very long to prove that you might not know as much as you think you know about the Old Testament. And that's with 60 messages behind us now, an Old Testament introduction. Don't go out of here now thinking, I'm getting off on a tangent, but it's a warning to the wise, don't go out of here thinking you're an Old Testament scholar now. Because we could just, and not myself, I mean someone who is really an Old Testament scholar. I'm not saying that I'm not, I'm just saying someone who does that for a living. Well, I do that for a living. Someone who teaches in a seminary, I'll get it right there, who is known as, Dr. So-and-so, Old Testament professor. Why, you know a few things about Ezra and Nehemiah, he'd laugh at that. I mean, he had to begin there. I'm not putting it down, or I wouldn't have spent over a year now teaching it if it wasn't worth learning. But all I'm saying is this is just the beginning of learning something about the Old Testament. And you have to be familiar with these periods or you get lost very easily. And it'd still be easy to get lost when you go back to some of your kings, like Zechariah. When was Zechariah king? Most people don't even know Zechariah was a king. They think Zechariah was a prophet. And Zechariah was, but not Zechariah. Z-A rather than Z-E, or Shalom, or some of the other ones that are rather obscure in the Old Testament. And the same can be true with these Persian kings, because, you see, we're doing you a favor with this chart here, because otherwise I'd just be telling you all this, Artaxerxes, and you'd have to be drawing the picture yourself in your mind of how they go in order. And that's why we've got a favor for us here. They're all right in order. And they become very important during this time period. And when we get into another class, you see, this ends with around 390 BC. But that still gives us 390 years before we get to New Testament. And the kings don't end here. They go right on into an Artaxerxes III and a Darius II, and then finally we end with a Darius III who comes to the throne the same time Alexander the Great does in 336 BC. Now, you don't have to know that. We haven't even gotten to that. That's way past biblical material here that we're given. All we go down through is down through the time of Jaddua, which takes us right down to around 400 BC. But there are just a whole lot of other things when you begin studying the end of the Persian Empire, which ends after Darius III, and you've got the beginning of the Greek Empire, and then for well over 100 years at the beginning of the Greek Empire, you've got the Ptolemies, who are controlling Palestine, and then with the rise of Antiochus III or Antiochus the Great, then you've got a short period of the Seleucid control of Palestine, and then beginning with the Maccabean revolt in 166 with Mattathias, the high priest of Modin, and his sons, Judas and Jonathan and so forth, you've got another period of Hebrew independence that starts in, that formally starts in 142, that goes down to when Pompey takes Palestine in 63 BC. And all that will come after this. So you see, before you can know that, you have to know this, is what I'm saying. Okay, you can turn that off now. Let's start with Ezra's book here. Ezra is a priest and a scribe. We see this in chapter 7. He introduces himself to us, by the way, in his book in chapter 7 and verse 1. You see, none of the first 6 chapters of Ezra have anything to do with Ezra. I'll explain that in a moment. Ezra, as far as the man, begins in chapter 7 and verse 1 of his book. This is where he begins. First half of the book has nothing to do with him. Ezra 7:1. Now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, so now you know what king that is, king of Persia, then Ezra. And here's where we're first introduced to Ezra, the son of Sariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah. Verse 5, the son of Abishua, the son of Phinehas. Now it's getting back to familiar Old Testament names. The son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, all the way back to Moses' time, the chief priest. This Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses. Then down in verse 10, Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments, which was the function of the scribe. Then over in Nehemiah 8 in verse 1, we again see Ezra as the ready scribe in the law of Moses. Nehemiah 8:1. Now Ezra the man, chronologically, historically, comes just a little bit before Nehemiah. But yet his time overlaps Nehemiah, and they know each other, and they're seen together here in Nehemiah 8. And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate, and they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And then he goes on to all day long preach out of the Old Testament, and then have a translation into the language of the people, because of course they can't read or understand Hebrew anymore because they've been without their Hebrew language for so long. All they understand is Aramaic here at the time. But Ezra, being a scribe, of course, still understands and can read and can speak Hebrew, and this is what he does in this chapter. Now let's go back to Ezra for an outline of the book. This is something you want to put in your memory. We've got a twofold major division. Ezra 1 through 6 has nothing to do with Ezra and Nehemiah. It is a history of the first return of the exiles, which takes us all the way back to 536 BC, long before Ezra was ever born. But he gives us a chronicle account, a history of the first return of the exiles under Zerubbabel. And this is found in chapters 1 through 6. Now under that, we can break that down. Chapters 1 and 2 we have a preparation for the first return. In chapter 1, we have the proclamation of Cyrus, the handing over of the vessels of the temple to Sheshbazzar, which apparently is another name for Zerubbabel. One is simply a foreign name and one is a natural name. Then in chapter 2, we have a list of those 50,000 that returned the first time. Around 42,000 Israelites, along with around 7,000 of their servants. Around 50,000 returned. Then the second division, the second division of our first part is chapters 3 through 6, where we have a building of the temple. Now that's why this portion, 3 through 6, will correspond with Haggai and Zechariah. And they happen to be mentioned here, because they're the prophets that God raises up to come on the scene and prophesy for them to begin to build the temple. Which you see, for instance, in chapter 3 and verse 8, as well as verse 10. They laid the foundation of the temple, and so forth. You get the end of Ezra 3. This portion, 3 through 6, will correspond with Haggai and Zechariah. And they happen to be mentioned here, because they're the prophets that God raises up to come on the scene and prophesy for them to begin to build the temple. Which you see, for instance, in chapter 3 and verse 8, as well as verse 10. They laid the foundation of the temple, and so forth. You get the end of Ezra 3. So 3, 4, 5, and 6 deal with their problems of getting the temple rebuilt. Now remember, they start it in 536 and aren't allowed to finish it until way down 520, then 516. So there's a 20-year period there because of all the correspondence that goes back between Cyrus and them, and between Darius and them, and their adversaries, the Samaritans, before the temple is finally built. And it's nothing on the scale of a Solomon's temple. It's a very small one, just a replica in comparison to that. Then in chapters 7 through 10, now we have a history of the second return, which would be under Ezra. And then in Nehemiah, we'll get the third return. So that's where you find your 3 returns. The first return is in Ezra 1 through 6. And then between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra, you again have about a 3/4 of a century period that's all skipped over there. So he skips all over Ezra. That's where you fit the book of Esther in. Between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, the book of Esther fits in. So it's good if you just, had that written in. Then you'd know that whenever you finish reading the 22nd verse of Ezra 6, then it's time to go to Esther, because her book and the events that take place in her book come before chapter 7 of Ezra's book. But then in 7 through 10, we have a history of Ezra's return with around 1,700 Jews. And we can break that outline down to chapters 7 and 8. We have the actual second return of the exiles. Then chapters 9 and 10, we have the problem of mixed marriages that are dealt with in chapters 9 and 10. A purpose of Ezra's book is to give a history of the return of the first and the second group of exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem from a priestly point of view. To give a history of the first and second returns from a priestly point of view. First return found in the first half of the book, and then the second return found in the second half. Okay, probably what we've said here already about the outline is good enough in covering the book. You just have to go back and look in the chapters and you'll find what's going on. You go back to a place like chapter 5 and verse 1. Then here you have to be back during that first 536 to 516 period we gave you, because here Haggai and Zechariah are mentioned. And see, Haggai and Zechariah now, they're not living at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. They both have already died by this time. Malachi is the only prophet living during their time. But here in 5 and verse 1, then the prophets Haggai, the prophet Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and began to build the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. But you see, all the way back in chapter 3 and verse 10, foundation for the temple has already been laid. But that was back in 536. And they've been hindered now for 16 years. Until Haggai and Zechariah come on the scene in 520, and the temple is built, and by 516 you got a conclusion to this period. You see in chapter 6 and verse 1, Darius being the important king during this time period. And by the way, you can see there in verse 2, one of those 4 Persian capitals that I gave you, and you've got the correct name, or really both of them are correct, but generally it's known by its name over in the margin in Ezra 6 and verse 2. At Baktana. Now you already know about Babylon. When we go over to Nehemiah's book, chapter 1 of Nehemiah, we see that other important capital of the Persian Empire. The end of Nehemiah 1 and verse 1, where he says, when I was in Shushan the palace. Now this is back in 445 BC. Then you go over to Esther chapter 1. And verse 2. Now Esther has been on the throne prior to this time. So although Esther's book follows Nehemiah's in our Bible, it comes before it with its events. In those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace. This is where their great palace was. And if you go over to Daniel, which of course is a lot earlier than either one of these books that we're looking at right now, Daniel chapter 8, this was already an important capital center way back in Daniel's day. Daniel 8:1. The 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, this is during Belshazzar's time, and it came to pass, who was just a regent under Nabonidus, who was the important Babylonian king at this time, when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace. Well, you see, in all 3 places now it connects the important palace of the kings, and this happens to be a Babylonian palace now, but the Persians would naturally take over what Babylon had, which is in the province of Elam, that I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. And then the other one, Persepolis, the other capital, you won't find in Scripture. But we'll study some things about Persepolis in the future because it was one of the richest cities of the ancient world. Persepolis. Simply means the city of the Persians. Polis, Polis, is a Greek word for city. Like Minneapolis is the city of waters. And anything with a polis, it's a Greek word for city. If it's a polis, it's a city. So like Heliopolis, which is another important city, but that's down in Egypt, is the city of the sun. Heli for the helium, Heliopolis, city of the sun. Persepolis, city of the Persians, and Minneapolis, the city of waters. You didn't know that, did you? See, I know more about your state than you do, probably. You don't even know when you got statehood here, do you? Well, someone's guessing out there. But we're not in Minnesota history, so we won't get off in that, will we? Got to know something about where you are. I know about Mississippi, but I also have to know about Minnesota. We've had 3 years to learn something. By the way, it was 3 years ago from tonight that we were packing up to move here. We left 3 years ago from tomorrow morning. That's what we were busy doing, driving here. Hallelujah. We didn't know where we'd be 3 years from that night, standing here teaching end of Old Testament introduction. Hallelujah. Okay, Nehemiah's book. Let's go to Nehemiah. We date Nehemiah around 445 B.C., and he is a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Nehemiah 1 and verse 11. He's a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now see, Ezra has already gone back now, and they've done whatever they can do as far as a restoration of religious reform is concerned. You see, Ezra is a priest and a scribe. Ezra's not interested in getting anything built. The temple has already been built, and some things of the city had been built, but they needed to be refortified, because we learn here from Nehemiah 1 and verse 3 that they had been burned down, that part of the wall which had been previously fortified and built back in Zerubbabel's time. But Ezra's concern is a religious, spiritual concern for the people. He's a ready scribe in the law of Moses, and his purpose in going back there is to teach them religious reform and get everyone on the ball, spiritually speaking. Now, Nehemiah, although Nehemiah, of course, is a believer, his ministry is more in a secular area as far as getting the city rebuilt again. So you could say that Ezra's book is the spiritual of the two books, whereas Nehemiah is the secular of the two books. Nehemiah leaves the religious reform up to Ezra, as we see him reading from the Torah in Nehemiah chapter 8. Now, the immediate spark for Nehemiah's interest in his homeland, you see, he's got a very high rank now in the Persian government. But the immediate spark for his interest is found in the 3rd verse of his 1st chapter. They said to me that the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. Now, this would include Ezra, because Ezra's over there right now. Now, evidently, Nehemiah and Ezra didn't know each other prior to this time, but they learn of each other. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, which means that at least a portion of it had to have been fortified back in the time of Zerubbabel, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass when I heard these words, I sat down and mourned, and he begins to pray because of the destruction of the walls of the city, which opens the city and which opens the temple up to the plunder of the various tribes that still are around them. So in chapter 2, we have him embarking on his journey, which makes up the 3rd return of the exiles. Now, an outline for his book, chapters 1 through 7, we have a rebuilding and a fortifying of the wall. Because for an ancient city, that's one of your most important considerations. Naturally, for defensive purposes, you have to have your wall fortified and strong. And so this is what Nehemiah's concern is. And this takes up the first 7 chapters. Now, here in chapter 2, we'll start back in verse 1 to show you how this came about. It came to pass in the month Nisan, which is 4 months later from the beginning of the book, the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. And now I had not been before time sad in his presence. That's why Nehemiah's book has that verse that the joy of the Lord is your strength. He had always had joy prior to this time. Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. He felt he'd be killed. Then said the king, and said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? And then the king said unto me, For what dost thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said unto the king, If it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. The end of verse 8, and the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And so in chapter 2, he is allowed to go back to the city, and then we've got in chapters 3 through 7 all of the problems with the man known as Sanballat concerning the building of the walls again. Now in chapter 7, we put this under our first division of the outline, but in chapter 7 we happen to have a duplication of Ezra 2, which speaks all the way back to the time of Zerubbabel, that first return of that first group of exiles. He's simply giving this as part of the history of his book, which shows that Ezra and Nehemiah are separate. Although they're joined together, they're still separate, because why have Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7 if it's really just one book by one author? You're repeating yourself word for word between Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. But you've got two different authors writing these two different books that at a later time came together because they deal with pretty much the same time period. Okay, then we start chapter 8 on through chapter 10. We have the covenant that the people make to keep the law. And this comes on the basis of all the inspired preaching and reading that they received from Ezra here in chapter 8. One of the interesting things that happens is found here in verse 13. They had not observed this for hundreds of years, as a matter of fact. Because just because we've got our period of the monarchy in Israel doesn't mean that all the kings are doing, even the righteous kings, doing all of the things that were required in the law of Moses. And this is one of the things that they hadn't been doing. Verse 13. The second day were gathered together the chief of the fathers of all the people, the priests and the Levites, unto Ezra the scribe, even to understand the words of the law. And they found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths in the feast of the 7th month, the Feast of Tabernacles, and that they should publish and proclaim in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, Go forth unto the mount, and fetch olive branches, and pine branches, and myrtle branches, and palm branches, and branches of thick trees, to make booths, as it is written. So the people went forth, and brought them, and made themselves booths, every one upon the roof of his house, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the street of the water gate, and in the street of the gate of Ephraim. And all the congregation of them that were come again out of captivity made booths, and sat under the booths, for since the days of Joshua the son of Nun unto that day had not the children of Israel done so, and there was very great gladness. You see, even during David's time, they didn't fulfill all of the law of Moses that was required of them, because he tells us it's not been since the time of Joshua the son of Nun. That's not Joshua the priest here. That's Joshua the successor to Moses, a whole millennium prior to this time, that they had been negligent in some of the things that Mosaic law required. In chapter 9, again, you've got some more of that reading of the law by the priests and by the Levites. Then in chapter 10, you've got an enumeration of some of the important people involved. Chapters 11 and 12, 1 to 7 gave us the building of the wall. 11 to 12, we have the dedication of the wall. You have a whole religious ceremony where they try to get enough people back in Jerusalem to have a population there. And you see in the first few verses of chapter 11 how they go about getting some people back, because no one wants to live there. They want to live out in their own little estates that they've already established out in the country. Who wants to live in the inner city. But in these first few verses, you find out how some of them were talked into coming back. And then when you get over to chapter 13, all of 11 and 12, dedication of the wall. In chapter 13, we've got, of course, the conclusion to Nehemiah's book. But what we have here is Nehemiah's second governorship. You see, he first of all came over and spent 12 years with the people. This is shown to us back in Nehemiah 5 and verse 14. So really Nehemiah comes twice. He comes back and stays 12 years, and then he has an absence where he goes back to Persia and stays there for an indeterminate amount of time, and then he comes back, and chapter 13 is his second time back. 5:14, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year, even unto the 32nd year, 12 years of Artaxerxes the king, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor, which of course he was, and he had the right to do, but he forepassed some of his rights. Then over in chapter 13 and verse 6, we see that he's telling us about things that took place when he wasn't there that he found out about later. But by the time we get to 13 and verse 7, he's back in Palestine. Before we look at those verses, you can see this outlined again for you on your chart. You've got his 12-year period, 445 to 433, and no one knows how long he was back in Babylon. They give us a 13-year time period, which may or may not be true. We'll just leave it with that because no one knows exactly. We know it had to be several years, like a decade, in order for the religious conscience of the people to fall into such dispute, which of course it does, and that's what Nehemiah 13 is showing us, that Nehemiah evidently has been absent a long time because things aren't going as they should be going here. And of course Ezra, he's not here on the scene anymore. Nehemiah is the only one left. You see there from 433 to 420, well, that shows him back in Babylon. And then 420, and they've got a question mark, or whenever, is when we've got Nehemiah 13 and verse 6. In all this time was I not at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days, and he doesn't tell us how long, you see, he just says certain days, which evidently is over a decade, a long period, obtained I leave of the king. Now, the important problems that he's come across here at the very end of his book and the end of his ministry concern two of our post-exilic important high priests in Jerusalem. The first one, Eliashib, and the second one, his son, Joiada. Why? Well, look in Nehemiah 13:7. He says, when I came to Jerusalem, I understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah. Now, Eliashib is one of the high priests. He's on the very bottom of your chart underneath the name of Ezra. But his ministry extends on down through most of the time of Nehemiah. What was that evil that he did to Tobiah, who was one of those that worked with Sanballat in trying to stop the building of the walls? He prepared him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, gave him the privileges of a Levite or of a priest. And of course that was an abomination as far as Nehemiah was concerned, which shows all of the problems now that even the high priests, those who are supposed to be the religious leaders, have gotten themselves into. And then down in verse 28, what's worse than that, the son of Eliashib, Joiada, who becomes high priest, becomes the son-in-law of Sanballat, which means he marries the daughter of Sanballat. Now, Sanballat, along with Tobiah, was one of those wicked men. And notice what Nehemiah says, therefore I chased him from me. Wasn't concerned about what people thought about running someone out of church. He says, I chased him away from me because he was married to someone that they were not allowed to marry. Remember back in Ezra, the last couple of chapters, 9 and 10 of Ezra, that was the problem they were having there, was mixed marriages. And those were mixed marriages of people that had come back with Zerubbabel. And then their sons and so forth had married people in the land. You've got a tremendous problem in Ezra 9 and 10. And that's what his book closes in dealing with. Now when we get to Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah is closing his book and his ministry with the same thing. You've still got the problem of mixed marriages. And you see, this took place those 13 years he was back in Babylon. Because Ezra's no longer with them, and their important governor, their important secular leader, who also, of course, was a religious, spiritual man, Nehemiah is no longer with them, and they begin to marry foreign wives. as well as a lot of other things. Start here in verse 15, and I'll show you some of the other things that are happening. He said, "In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath." Well, Old Testament law says no working on the Sabbath, especially not making any of that wine. "Bringing in sheaves, lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold," as one preacher pronounced it, "victuals." But of course that's the old King James word for victuals. "There dwelt men of Tyre also therein." Well, they weren't supposed to have any dealings with Gentiles. These are Gentiles, "which brought fish and all manner of ware," a flea market here, "and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah in Jerusalem. And I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us, and upon this day?" He's saying that's what got us into this problem, is disobeying God. And now that he's delivered us from our captivity, here we go disobeying him all over again. "Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, then he takes control. He commands that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should be no burden brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Then I testified against them, and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I will lay hands on you." He doesn't mean the laying on for healing either. "From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath." Verse 23, "Those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod," these are Philistine wives, "of Ammon the Ammonites, and of Moab the Moabites. And their children spake half in the speech of the Philistines, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves." And he says, didn't Solomon sin by these outlandish women? And then in verse 28, he's got, of course, a prime example of one of those that certainly shouldn't have been married to someone like that. And then, as an Old Testament saint would be allowed to do, he brags on himself, verses 29 to 31, in a pious, correct manner, asking God not to forget all of his good works. "Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, and the covenant of the priesthood, and of the Levites. Thus cleansed I them from all strangers, and appointed the wards of the priests and Levites, every one in his business. And for the wood offering at times appointed, and for the firstfruits, remember me, O my God, for good." So he closes his book by asking God to remember all of the good works that he's performed. Okay, a memory verse for Ezra, Ezra 7:26. "And whosoever will not do the law of thy God, and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily upon him, whether it be unto death, or to banishment, or to confiscation of goods, or to imprisonment." Ezra 7:26 and Nehemiah 9 and I believe verse 33. "Howbeit thou art just," this is in part of Nehemiah's prayer, "in all that is brought upon us, for thou hast done right, but we have done wickedly." Ezra 7:26, Nehemiah 9:33.
Why did they change the name of the word Hebrew, and they seem to be calling them Jews in this book, not Hebrew?
Very, very good question. He's asking, but I'm not going to answer because I've already got a message on that already typed up and ready for the future. He's asking why call them, are you saying why call them Jews here rather than call them Hebrews? For an important reason.
That's right.
But I've already got that worked up for the future. But there are, you see, they go by different names. Today we call them Israelis. If you're an Israelite, you don't call them an Israelite like they used to be called. Now they're Israelis. Jews, Hebrews, children of Israel, sons of Judah. They've gone by a lot of different names. But we'll look at that in the future when we look at some more Jewish history. We've covered Old Testament, but we've never studied Jewish history. That will take, again, all of from the time of Abraham up until whatever year, whenever we get to that class where we study some of the history of the Jews. Because most people know very little about Jewish history after the time of the New Testament, because they're not an important world figure, and they're not a biblical figure anymore because there's no Bible after that time. Everyone knows some things about the Jews in the Old Testament and up through 1st century A.D. But what happened from then until Hitler? People know what happened since Hitler, but what happened those 19 centuries in between that? And that's where we'll cover some of the names of the people of God. I have in my files teachings now already ready to take us all the way to 1985. And those are all already done, completely ready to go. So we got a lot to go. And I got another one started, about 25 messages in another series started that will start 1985. That'll take us through 1986. Hallelujah. Got it all ready. Some of us have to be like Proverbs 6 says, and go to that ant, thou sluggard, and learn. You can learn some things from creation. You can learn some things from the ant. Don't be a sluggard and caught behind time.
For a complete